Hello, my name is Amy Coe, and I'm going to give a practice talk for my SIGCSE 2026 keynote, so bear with me for any mistakes I might make. All right, thank you all for traveling here and for your engagement this morning, and thank you to the Indigenous people of St. Louis on whose this land, this convention center was built for their ongoing hospitality and grace amidst indifference and erasure. Before I begin, I want to give a little bit of a content warning. I made this talk to destabilize and to question what we do here in this community. If that's not what you need right now, feel free to check out. But if you're not sure, I hope you'll listen closely and actively so we can talk later. Finally, one disclaimer, I illustrated this talk, and that includes some illustrations of colleagues that I'm confident I have not captured all of your glory. My drawings come from a place of love. So I would love to talk today about all the exciting things I'm working on in the Center for Learning, Computing, and Imagination. Educational justice in programming language design, CS learning and refugee support agencies, the technologies we need for highly multilingual CS classrooms, the communities that CS teachers need to form and thrive, the ways that queer teens are building cultures of resistance to AI in their CS learning. The problem is there's a dark cloud over our heads. And it's a cloud of hate and cruelty and violence. And in this country and in the state of Missouri, our leaders are arguing that people should be divided, mistrustful, ignorant, that we should retrofit society around bullshit machines trained on stolen archives of human expression, much of which traces a history of oppression, that white Western men should dominate and subjugate people based on race, gender, creed, belief, that human progress be dictated by power and religion, not by science, engineering, arts, humanities, or the institutions that support them. That the bodies of children, women, and trans people should be controlled by the government, that by law, in particular in Missouri, trans and queer people should be stigmatized, erased, and excluded from society, that people with disabilities should be ejected from work, healthcare, and education in the name of fairness, that genocide is justified in the name of vengeance, and that this fragile earth we call home shall be abused, mined, and paved into a place to survive instead of a place to thrive. I mention these dark clouds as a reminder that many of the people in this room, myself included, are in distress or in active resistance, and that our experiences in this community are just a small glimpse of the far greater harm happening in this state, this city, this country, and this world. And yet, while there is so much more I could say about this moment, and while our ability to understand what is broken is central to fixing it, we also need to talk about the world that we want. And so that's what I'd like to do today, at least for our corner of computing education and the many impacts that we have on the broader world. So in that spirit, I want to ask, what should computing education be, if not hateful, cruel, and destructive? What values should we center in education, if not division and domination? How can we focus our attention on those values? What kind of systems of learning and education do we need to enable those values? How might those systems play a part in moving us past this broader area of hate? And there are a lot of answers to these questions already. I've spent the past 5 years arguing, for example, for a critical consciousness of computing, amplifying the ideas of critical pedagogy from Paulo Freire, bell hooks, and others. In a recent piece, Alexander Hall and Brent Steele argued for joy as a kind of subversive form of pedagogical defiance, through joy that centers embodiment, public spaces, and relationality. Art education researchers James Woglum wrote about radical spaces of learning as what-if worlds that center entanglement and noise and chaos as a resistance to compliance and convention. And so I want to build on these arguments today, suggesting that at the heart of these ideas is a very particular kind of love that we rarely talk about in education, and in computing education in particular. Now, when I say love, you're probably thinking of everything this pink heart represents. So I want to be clear from the outset that I'm not talking about romantic love or sexual love. Take those and set them aside. Rather, I'm talking about the kind of love that shows up when someone truly cares for someone and about someone. The kind of love that great teachers give students in supporting their security, their transformation, their growth. The kind of love that focuses our systems of learning on meeting students where they are at and with what they need. I want to talk about this love and how we might center it not only in our teaching and our research, but in our defense of schools and higher education from the US government, and the world that we'll need to build from the rubble of our institutions. So I'll share my thoughts in 5 parts. I will start by talking about my own experiences with love in computing education. I'll then talk about the nature of love and its complicated relationship with teaching and learning. I then want to unpack love's fraught relationship with computing and computing education as ideas. I'll then share several examples for how to center love in computing education practice and research, giving us a path forward towards healing this part of our broken world. And then I'll end to a call for action from each of you, hopefully giving you a frame in which to think about this conference, but also your broader work and role in this world. So I'll start with my own biography of love in CS learning. I want to start by saying that I didn't grow up with a lot of love in my life. My parents took care of me materially, but they didn't really know how to love me emotionally. In my large extended family, death was normal. There was breast cancer, bone cancer, brain cancer, leukemia, suicide, car accidents, asphyxiation, diabetes, heart disease. In my 99% white Christian suburb of Portland, I was also frequently bullied in school for my race and gender expression, called brownie and chink, sissy, pussy, the F word, and regularly assaulted, shoved into lockers, kicked and punched. My friends were as well, some of them permanently injured by schoolyard violence. And after my parents divorced in primary school, we were poor, and my brother and I were homeless part-time with my father. I lived a nomadic life between my parents' homes. And amidst all of this, as a deeply closeted transgender girl, I could not imagine loving myself, let alone anyone else loving me. I believed there was something wrong with me, and I spent most of my adolescence and young adulthood creating an elaborate persona to survive a world of homophobia, transphobia, and loss. And yet, despite all of this, love was abundant in one place of my life: learning. And in particular, learning about computing. I show myself here, staring at this screen from every angle to represent how the many possible worlds that computing helped me create and imagine were an escape from the hostile world that I was in. Computers kept me alive. They gave me refuge. Over time, they gave me purpose. But it wasn't computers alone, or even computers especially. It was fundamentally the people in my life who loved me and embraced my fascination with computers. So let me share a few stories to illustrate. This is Mr. Hart, his mullet and 3 Roman numerals. He was my 3rd grade teacher in 1988. He was an artist first and a teacher second. One of his jobs was to teach us multiplication. Rather than give us tables to memorize, he took us back to Roman civilization and its numerals. We simulated marketplaces in the classroom, making art for each other, selling it to each other, and using multiplication for our bulk transactions. And we did all of this with Roman numerals, adding and subtracting and sometimes multiplying, and we all began to hate the number system's clumsiness. We traveled back to ancient India, where he talked about Brahmi numerals and Al-Khwarizmi's writing about them and how they fascinated Fibonacci, especially eventually replacing numerals in Europe. We adopted them into our market, and the number systems became fluid and predictable and fast. And I was fascinated by the stories of mathematicians who were fascinated by numbers. Why did they care so much about them? How did they invent new systems? How were they able to travel the world to learn about them? I asked Mr. Hart, and he said, "I love this question. Let's find out together." And we spent weeks talking about the world's number systems and their trade-offs. I left 3rd grade with a sense that my questions were valid, that the world of calculation might be full of answers rich with history, and that Mr. Hart cared deeply about my curiosity. In 1988, a year later, when I was 9, my mother, a 5th grade teacher, became enamored with computers too. She was obsessed with the idea that they could be a place for play and productivity, and she saved up buying our family an Apple IIe. She didn't have a particular vision for what we'd do with it. Instead, she believed in a vision that might be useful for something. It was delivered after one school day, and I got home before she did, and I dragged the 3 big boxes inside the house, and I was fascinated by it. I tore open the boxes, I started putting things together based on the instructions inside, and by the time she was home, I had it on the floor with floppy disks inside, where I'd found a word processor and a strange home simulation game called Little Computer People. This is an illustration of what happened when she came home. She wasn't angry with me for opening the boxes. Instead, she came into the living room and said, "What do you notice?" And she sat with me and my brother for hours, and I showed her what I'd found and what I didn't understand, and we tinkered and learned together, seeing what it could and couldn't do. And that evening, my mind was spinning. What could it do? What could I make it do things? What couldn't it do? I knew that day that it didn't matter what I wondered or what I asked or what I wanted to learn. My mother would be there, wherever I went, learning with me. A few years later, in 1993, I was 13. We had just replaced our 2E with an Apple LC2. On it was HyperCard. My brother and I, shown here with a graph of interconnected HyperCard screens, would often draw for hours, making weird art for each other, using the zoom feature to create creepy, claustrophobic mazes with kind of hostile rules only siblings would make for each other, testing each other's will. One day, I noticed that the images we made could be linked, and this opened up a whole new world of possibilities. I showed my brother, and we started plotting together an epic, interconnected world that went deep down into the dark caves of the earth, where the strangest creatures lived and only let you out of their dungeons if you could solve their riddles. This simple abstraction became elaborate webs of inside jokes, which my brother and I would reference and meta-reference until finally we brought our friends into these worlds, and we lost ourselves in linked cycles of interactive narrative absurdity. Our learning with each other here was not for a purpose. It was not productive. We created with and for each other as an expression of love through making humor and interactive documents. That I learned about graphs and nodes and edges was incidental. What mattered was that my brother reciprocated a kind of unconditional acceptance of my computational expression, and that I did the same for him. That same year, I started pre-algebra. And our teacher, Mr. Ryland, had us buy TI-82 graphing calculators like the one shown here. By then, I was fascinated with computers, and a portable computer that looked remarkably like my beloved Game Boy was a dream come true. A classmate had an older brother who had a version of Tetris on it. I ordered a link cable, transferred it about a month later onto my calculator, and I was disappointed to find that it was very slow. Pieces would erase and re-render on the order of seconds. I spent weeks trying to understand how the game was built, reading and rereading Chapter 5 of the manual, and eventually found that the text console rendered much faster than the graph, and I rewrote the rendering engine to use letters and punctuation as Tetris pieces. I was so excited, I shared it with everyone in my math class, and suddenly everyone was playing Tetris on their calculators instead of learning pre-algebra. It was a classroom management disaster from Mr. Ryland's perspective, but also suddenly a game party. And my teacher, Mr. Ryland, stopped the class, and rather than scold me or confiscate our calculators, he said, "This is so cool. Whoever made this, teach me how you did it. Let's talk after class, and then we can teach everyone else." I stayed after over the lunch period, and I showed him what I'd done, and he told me how proud of me he was for learning, and for sharing, and for teaching him. We spent many lunches after that, learning about the rest of the calculator's functionality together, and he brought that learning into our math education. And I spent the rest of the year with pride. My curiosity was valid in school and in math and wherever else it might take me. A few years later in 1996, I was a high school sophomore struggling in physics. I was not understanding Newtonian mechanics, and I was on track for a B. I'd learned enough about programming, including some Pascal that was installed on one of the abandoned computers in their library, that I decided to try to make a sense of simulation of momentum and mass. I toiled away each morning in the computer lab on our old 286 PCs and eventually made some balls bounce into each other on a single axis, preserving momentum. It was way more fun than doing algebra, especially because I'd made the background flash wildly every time they collided. My physics teacher, Mr. Kugler, shown here smashed between two colliding balls and a Pascal keywords, walked in one morning in the library and saw my simulation. "That's so cool. What's that?" he said. I meekly told him about struggling with momentum and trying to make sense of it with collisions. And he said, "I've always wanted to make simulations for class too. If you show me how you did this, how about I help you with the algebra part?" Spent the next few months at lunch talking about programming and physics and simulations, and he asked me about my aspirations, and he helped me see the many possibilities in science, even in software development and research. I left that class not just having figured out physics, but with a sense that Mr. Kugler wanted me to find my way in the world, whatever that might be. A year later, in 1997, I was a junior in calculus. I had gotten very interested in creating virtual worlds with organic shapes. I wanted to create interactive digital art that captured fractals and liquids, and all the books I'd read on 3D graphics used triangles, which were far too angular. Ellipses felt way more organic, and so I started rendering ellipses in 3D space. The problem was, on our ancient Intel 286 computers, drawing ellipses was super slow. I'd figured out an algorithm to render them using the formula I'd learned in my geometry class, but it used square roots, and it was the roots that seemed to be slowing everything down. I asked my teacher, Miss Hudson, shown here pointing to a root on the blackboard, if she knew a fast way to calculate square roots by hand. And she said, "That is a fascinating question. I don't really know what that even means, but I think I know who to ask. Let's find out together." It turned out that she had a PhD from Texas A&M, and so she wrote to her former advisor. He mailed a 90-year-old book on interlibrary loan from MIT, which was full of all kinds of manual algorithms for computing approximate roots, but in this archaic math notation, since it was pre-standardization. And so she sat with me after school for a few weeks, translating the chapter into modern math syntax, and then I translated the math into an algorithm. My ellipses rendered 100 times faster, and I spent the rest of the summer cleaning spills at my summer grocery store job, also making weird organic 3D art for my teachers and friends. And I knew that it didn't matter what it was or why I made it, only that it was me who was making it. It took me a long time to understand this series of experiences, for how they shaped me, for how it was my own interests that drove them, and how I had parents and siblings and teachers that met me where I was at and wherever I was going, for how a certain kind of love was at the center of all of these, and it was the love that made each of them push myself forward, further to wherever I might go. And in many ways, this love in learning and of learning was what saved me. It created a space of safety, of affirmation, of care. I was able to build a sense of self-worth around computing, to compensate for the complete lack of self-worth I had for myself in other ways. But it was also a story of privilege, of well-prepared teachers with time to respond to my interests, of a school with computers, of a mother who is a great teacher and curious about computers. This was not the experience of most children in the 1980s and 1990s, and it is no accident that I'm here on the stage with a PhD in the positions of power that I hold. This moment is the outcome of a consistent, uninterrupted sequence of unconditional loving support, interest development, and opportunity that easily overcame the loss, grief, and turmoil in every other aspect of my life. So before I continue, I want you to take a minute to reflect on your own experience of love and education. All right, let's come back together. Theorizing about love is not new. It is also fraught, because love can mean so many different things. And so I want to take a moment to be more precise around what I mean by love in learning before we return to computing and computing education. As I mentioned before, I am not talking about romantic love or sexual love. I am also not talking about love in religion, as it's conceptualized in Christianity or Islam or other faiths as a form of worship or submission to a deity. Love of this kind may very well have a place in your own life and even in your teaching, but today I'm speaking in strictly secular terms. We also can't talk about love without first acknowledging the impact of Greek philosophers on Western conceptions of love. The Greeks had so many kinds, but there are a few I find relevant to learning. Canadian psychologist John Allen Lee organized them into several types back in the 1970s. One is agape. This one is a universal kind of love, a love of all. It has some roots in love of God and God's love for human beings. This shows up in education in the way that we talk about learners as all having inherent value. Another is storge, a kind of familial love, like that of a parent. This affection might show up between that of a teacher and a student who care and value each other. A third is xenia, a kind of generosity towards newcomers and foreigners. This shows up in how we welcome students from across the globe into our classrooms, whether refugees or immigrants. And then there's philia, a kind of loyalty, community, and equality, a collectivist love. And then there's philatia, or love of self. It's hard for a teacher to be loving in many ways if they don't love themselves and give themselves compassion. Social psychologists like Tim Lomas have more recently examined descriptions of love across language and culture and found that these seem to be robust across cultures. But he also found others, like sebomai, a kind of reverential worshiping love, which sometimes students give to respected teachers. Of course, neither the Greeks nor psychologists own conceptions of love. Education scholars like John Dewey, Paolo Freire spoke of love implicitly as a kind of agency that is granted to students. There's also counseling psychologist Carl Rogers, who wrote about the necessary and sufficient conditions for therapeutic relationships, caregivers' unconditional positive regard, an empathetic understanding of someone's internal frame of reference, and the explicit communication of all of this understanding. And then there's Bell Hooks, who wrote on both love and learning and of how we devalue it sometimes. She wrote, taught to believe the mind and not the heart is the seat of learning, many of us believe to speak of love with any emotional intensity means we will be perceived as weak and irrational. Maybe that's how you're feeling right now about this talk. So these ideas from education, psychology, sociology, and feminism, they show that love and teaching might be about perspective taking and acceptance. These ideas also mirror studies of parents' desires around how teachers relate to their students, which show that parents want more than care. They want a kind of professional love to be complementary to the love given in parenting, to support a student's mind, growth, and wellness. But I have to say that of all of the definitions I've found, my favorite is a recent theoretical paper on love by Igor Jasinski and Tyson Lewis from 2016. Tyson is an art education researcher in North Texas. He and Igor wrote about the inherently problematic ideas of love that show up in the classroom. One is tough love, the kind of stern love that loves a student for what they will become, but not who they are or who they want to become. I will love you if you learn C++. Reciprocal love is the kind of transactional love in which teachers love a student for how the student transforms the teacher. Your passion for generative AI inspires my research. And identified love is one in which teachers love a student for the identity that a student has, but in a way that positions identity as static and precludes change. I'm so proud of you for becoming such an excellent theorem prover. Jasinski and Lewis argue that all three of these show up in education, and when they are fundamentally conditional. They're only offered on the basis of a learner achieving, behaving, or being in a particular way. And so they argue that the only kind of love that truly respects students' agency, dignity, and capacity for change is a whatever love, shown here as a yellow smiley face. Whatever love loves a student for who they are, but also for their ever-evolving positionality and for whatever transformations that might entail. I love you because you are you, and not more or less because you do or don't like computing. But I will also love you for whatever skills, talents, and interests you might grow, whether those have to do with computing or not. My positive regard for you is unconditional, and I will walk with you wherever you go, whoever you become. It's this idea of love that felt most true to the love that I felt from my mother, my brother, and my teachers. Each of them said, I love you for who you are now, interested in floppy disks and dungeon trolls and Tetris and animation and square roots, but I also love you for whomever you will become, whether a CS major or a PhD student or a professor or a late-blooming woman learning to love herself. Who you are now is enough, and who you are later will be too. This idea of whatever love doesn't say much about the scope of whatever. For that, I think we have to go back to Bell Hooks, but also the many other branches of scholarship on identity. This bright yellow heart that I'll use to represent whatever love throughout the rest of this talk, it can come in many shapes and sizes. It can be anti-racist, working with youth to imagine worlds that dismantle racial hierarchies of society, in computing or outside of it. It can be feminist, working with youth to imagine worlds that dismantle gender hierarchies. It can be gender affirming, working with youth to imagine worlds that respect the beautiful natural diversity of sex, gender identity, and gender expression. It can be ability affirming, working with youth to imagine worlds that respect the beautiful diversity of the ways we communicate, think, and move in the world. It can be class aware, imagining worlds where economic power does not dictate a life's possibilities. And it can be culturally affirming, working with youth to imagine worlds where the diversity of language, beliefs, and traditions is an asset in learning, not a liability. Because all of these aspects of identities can shift and change and shape our learning across our lifetimes, a whatever love embraces all of these dimensions, but also all of the ways that they can change. It's fundamentally unconditional and focused on learning, identity, and transformation. So before we return to CS, let's return to you. Turn to a different neighbor. Did you have a whatever love in your computing education or in your education in general? Okay, let's come back together. So what, if anything, does a whatever love have to do with computing and computing education? In this third part, I want to argue that whatever love and the ideas of computing are in significant tension with each other. So let's start by observing that most of us are teachers in this room, or instructional designers, or education researchers. Many of us stand up in rooms like this, in front of screens with a sea of students trapped in a chair listening to us talk, just like I'm doing to you right now. As I talk about the ideas in computing, I want you to think about how love shows up in how you teach them, or how you research teaching them. Does it center a whatever love or something else? One conflict between love and computing is at the foundation of binary, discrete logic. Take Claude Shannon's idea that every message we might send is reducible to bits with prescribed meaning. This is an idea that disregards that messages are contextual, situated, momentary. It rejects the idea that messages we send each other, the documents create, are contextual, framing them as instead abstract and devoid of humanity. To digitize is destructive, and perhaps even dehumanizing, erasing the importance of social context and the inherent indescribability of information. This is not whatever love. It is an erasure of positionality, of speaker, of meaning. Whatever love is in tension with data structures. Here, this data structure that encodes gender, race, ability, and nationality as a sequence of bits starts from the premise that every idea, that everything we might want to remember in a digital store can be categorized, classified, delineated, structured, and even expressed. This disregards the many ways that our memories and identities are constantly remade by our experiences, by our remembering, that even the structure of how we organize our self-conceptions can be reshaped by cultural change. Data structures, in contrast, harden things for what they are now and how they are structured now, but do not easily allow for transformation, especially of the structures themselves. I know this because of the hundreds of hours I've spent trying to change my name across thousands of databases, whose data and schemas I cannot edit, and yet do not accurately reflect my name or gender identity. This is not a whatever love. It is an erasure of agency. Algorithms fare no better. The premise of an algorithm is that every meaningful action in the world is sufficiently reducible to a series of steps, deterministic or probabilistic. This algorithmic visualization is of decisions and passes and lists and operations and trap our actions and the world into structures and processes and procedures that we do not shape, that do not reflect the diversity of human action. This is not a whatever love. It is an erasure of our actions' true nature as emotionally guided, fallible reason. And our latest meaning for AI, the billion-parameter convolutional neural network, poses its own fraught tensions. We train them on data that is a record of the past that was never meant to determine our future. The plausible output Gen AI produces has started to become our reality, creating fake news, fake citations, fake programs, fake writing, fake images, fake realities. This is not a whatever love. It is a rejection of reality and the idea that culture, language, ideas, and identities are in our minds and not in our recorded histories and the language embeddings that they imply. Overall, computing is a medium for archiving brittle, reductive models of human experience, identity, and action, for normalizing the way that people show up in the world. It is a box in which we place ourselves, where the love we give each other is increasingly a resistance to its confines, where we try to make the box large enough to contain humanity's multitudes, but where people on its edges are crushed. Computing is a medium that is therefore fundamentally anti-positional. It leaves no room for loving people for who they are or might become. Instead, it is designed to lock us into structures, into history, and into rules that someone else has deemed normal or likely. That we use computing uncritically to shape our world and experiences is to constrain and harden what we are, individually and collectively, creating friction in our transformation and our liberation. This is not a whatever love, or any other kind of love I know of. It is a prison. And then there is computing education itself. I sometimes think of education systems as boxes of their own kind. A home, a schoolhouse, a college building. These are boxes in which our dominant form of computing education has been captured by a political economy of colonization, profit, exploitation, greed, displacement, replacement, policing. Our goals are not to see people's humanity and help it flourish, but to mold students into the right shape of cog, to be shoved into the machinery of Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Meta, Apple, or some lesser organization. Companies and even not-for-profits fight to replace the creativity of a teacher's whatever-love classroom with uniformity, chasing scale over relevance and responsiveness and sustaining cultures of learning. We talk about computing education as a pipeline, fueling profit in industry as if students are an ancient oil to be pressured through tubes at high speed, as opposed to unique individuals with many paths and agency and dreams that go beyond whatever network of channels our institutions have constructed. And rather than seeing cheating as a symptom of a failed system of credentialing, gatekeeping, and inequity, we position ourselves as police, detecting and punishing students trapped in the cracks of inhuman structures in our institutions, often ones we create ourselves through assessments and policies that force immoral choices for students' survival. And then when students come to us with who they are and who they want to become in sociology or art or politics or history, we react not with an invitation into computing and partnership to transform computing to realize their dreams, but with a dismissal. If that's who you are and that's who you want to become, you don't belong here. And rather than celebrate the diversity of students' values, whether they be justice or community, fairness or humor, respect or wisdom, we indoctrinate students on a narrow set of antisocial values of efficiency, domination, wealth, and disruption. Students come to see our education systems as upside down, as if computing has nothing to do with the rest of human experience, and find themselves only to be or become who they are outside of our alls. This is not a whatever love, it is exile. So I know most of you aspire to imagine a more loving computing education. And I've talked with you in the hallways. I've heard your struggle with the systems that we built and the values you hold. And I know you want to do better, but often don't know how to get there. And I'm not going to pretend to have the answers just because I happen to be the one on stage. In my teaching, in my administrative work, and even in my research, I have created these boxes. I have shunned students' interests, and I have diminished the things that they could become. And so in part 4 of this talk, I want to show you examples of people and places I think are realizing a whatever love in computing education and what they might have to teach us about how to do it. One of those places is the Kapoor Center, which partly lives in this 2-story building in Oakland, California. A few years ago, they synthesized some of the best scholarship on what it means to be responsive to students in CS learning, creating a plain language guide for CS learning called Culturally Responsive Sustaining Computer Science Education Framework. I think many of its ideas are compatible with realizing what whatever love in computing education might be. Here are 2. Student voice, student agency, and self-determination are valued, encouraged, and incorporated during the CS learning process. Student ideas and input are actively solicited from students to co-create classroom instruction. And 2, families and communities in their cultures and assets are incorporated into the design of CS curriculum, classrooms, and learning opportunities. Families and community members are intentionally sought out and included in the construction of CS classroom learning activities. This is a framework that redistributes power back to learners, their families, and communities rather than centralizing it in a teacher, a curriculum, or a tool. And it's one that centers students' positionality instead of the concepts and skills of computing, which are present but are necessarily subordinate to students' agency. I also want to recognize the beautiful work of Rick Roque, a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder in their information school. Over the past few years, she has examined joy. What is it in the context of computing education, and what is its relationship to learning? She finds in her work to create spaces where families and children come together to create with computing that joy is not a single emotion, but a tapestry of them, and more than anything else, an aesthetic for learning. She writes, emotion is typically marginalized in traditional computing spaces. Instead, reason is prioritized over emotion, abstract over the concrete. In education literature, emotions are often positioned as something that supports other learning outcomes. But emotional transformation can be the end goal too. In family creative learning, joy is the aesthetic of the experience. Not joy as positivity or happiness, but joy from transformation that emerges from the challenges and struggles they encounter as they create projects. I also want to elevate the work of Kylie Pepler, a professor at the University of California, Irvine in informatics. She has long examined the relationship between STEM and arts education. In one of her recent papers, Tools and Materials as Non-Neutral Actors in STEM education, it struck me as a powerful culmination of some of her inquiry. She finds that toolkits that privilege feminine or artistic elements significantly impact learning more than traditional toolkits used in schools, which showed little or no significant learning gains. She continued at the end of the paper, the materials used in classrooms are not read as neutral, despite efforts to design for neutrality. Youth with different backgrounds, experiences, preferences, and latent stereotypes will read and identify with materials in different ways. By diversifying the tools and materials we teach with, we have new ways to concretize challenging concepts as well as invite participation and signal the diversity, variation, and complexity of STEM content. This finding and Kylie's many other discoveries show that the computational media we use are not incidental. They speak to learners about who knowledge and tools are for and whether they are included in that set. Our choices of programming languages, of development environments, even large language models, are implicit choices about whose positionality will be loved. I am also fortunate to work with an amazing human teacher and scholar, Jane Everson, one of my PhD students soon to graduate, and now full-time with the philanthropic not-for-profit Foundry 10, working in community programs. I speak about her work not to elevate myself, but because she and her visions have transformed how I think about teaching, joy, and love. Jane, I would argue, is one of the most radically student-centered teacher scholars I know. Whatever happens in her classroom is a product of what students want and need to happen in that classroom, informed but not dictated by her expertise. But it also shows up in her research. For example, in her recent ICER 2025 paper last year, Dreaming of Difference, she and my other excellent student, Rodem Landesman, asked adolescents, what do you need CS education to be? And youth said quite clearly they need agency, but accountability from teachers. They want their whole selves, their communities, their relationships in and outside of the classroom to be valued. They want learning to be relevant to their lives and interests. They want to be seen as complex individuals with far more than just an interest in computing, but also the bridges between computing and their other selves to be fully embraced by CS teachers. She ends the paper with this quote, building trust comes from creating learning spaces and practices so that students feel they've been heard and are excited to enroll in classes where educators are attuned to their needs to make impacts both within and outside the classroom. In order to build trust with students so that they can do the critical work that matters, we need to listen to them and acknowledge their desires when it comes to CS education. This is a whatever love. It says, I love you for who you are and will become, in whatever way that does or doesn't connect to computer science. Another one of my recently graduate students, Mara Kirdani Ryan, and is now an assistant teaching professor at the University of Washington Information School with me. Like Jane, Mara has taught me so much, but largely about love and respect and identity. Their dissertation ended with a study of a class they taught in computer science at UW. It was no typical class. It invited students to come together in community and solidarity to talk about what they are told CS is, what CS is to them, and what they need CS to be in higher education. It was a deconstruction and examination of cultural norms in CS for the purpose of imagining different norms that better serve their needs. It was a place of vulnerability, identity work, and collective action. Here's one revealing quote from Mara's interviews. Honestly, the more I reflect on my identity and how I relate my identity to computing, I realize I've almost separated the two completely in my mind. Computing is my future career, but when I think about what makes me who I am, I think of my hobbies, my friends, my family, my likes, my dislikes. I think of what I do in my free time, not what I do for work. Mara concludes here that students whose personal narratives failed to fit within computing's dominant disciplinary narratives fragmented their identity, as fragmentation was in their best interest. This fragmentation was maintained as participants experienced that their positional identity and personal narratives were largely absent from their coursework, leading them to struggle to find community in computing, lose their voice, become jaded about their future, and flatten themselves in disciplinary spaces. For those who desired a more unified self, the identity work of reconciling disciplinary and positional identities could be fostered by safe, trusting, and vulnerable disciplinary spaces that welcomed participants' positional identity and centered students' shared fragmentation. And so while Mara's work here was centered on the pain and harm of being in a computer science learning space like this, it also showed that creating spaces for healing and integrating students' identities in and outside of CS is a potential pathway towards a computing education that is humane. You might even describe these spaces as centering a whatever love, making space and learning for students to shape their whole selves, including their fragmented CS parts typically severed from the rest of their lives. One last one. I'll elevate the teaching of one of my closest teaching partners, Adrienne Gifford. She's a middle school CS teacher just outside of Seattle. And Adrienne, more than anything, is courageous, bold, and curious in her teaching, always willing to reinvent her practices to find new ways through to youth. And she and I have been collaborating around ways of elevating students' language and cultural assets in CS learning, both to make them visible to their peers and Adrienne, but also to harness them as a resource for CS learning. Our focus for the past 2 years has been on asking, what does it mean to bring language, culture, language arts, and computing together? What kinds of new engagement and new identity does that enable? What kinds of challenges does that pose? We've had students write interactive poetry, tell interactive stories about their family cultures, create interactive learning materials about their languages for peers. In Adrienne's classroom, CS is inseparable from language, culture, identity, and growth. And I've learned so much in my collaboration with her. That educational programming languages have to be intricately designed for diversity, that students who are fluent in languages other than English have so much to share that is left outside of CS, that the cultural roots of ideas in computing, such as binary English ideas of truth values embedded in George Boole's conceptions of truth, are rich contexts for learning. This simple act, centering instead youth's evolving positionalities around language, culture, and creativity, is a kind of whatever love I see Adrienne express in her daily work. So what does this mean for us? I'd like us to reflect a bit, and then I'll take questions. These quotes from bell hooks echo in my mind, from teaching to transgress. The vast majority of our professors lacked basic communication skills. They were not self-actualized, and they often used the classroom to enact rituals of control that were about domination and the unjust exercise of power. In these settings, I learned a lot about the kind of teacher I did not want to become. To teach in a manner that respects and cares for the souls of our students is essential if we are to provide the necessary conditions where learning can most deeply and intimately begin. These are sentiments that are fundamentally about the central importance of an unconditional whatever love in teaching, a love that centers identity and positionality. She observes that respect and care do not happen without love, and the deepest of learning does not happen without a whatever love for what our students are and might become. She also observes that none of us is in a position to love our students if we cannot love ourselves, or even be kind to ourselves. That our institutions, our pedagogies, and our practices of control are an outgrowth of the love that we did not have. So what does that mean for us? The examples I shared show some pedagogies that reflect this love, but I think more than method or pedagogy, the implications are first for ourselves and our potentially fuzzy, forming whatever love hearts. As I noted before, I have not had a lot of love in my life. from others, or from myself. I never particularly wanted to control my students, but I also never particularly had the capacity to love them. I had to learn to love myself before I could give them the whatever love they needed to thrive. And that was a long journey of not only accepting my gender identity, but also processing the immense amount of other pain and trauma from my childhood and adulthood. That meant therapy. It meant tears. It meant disorientation, rejection, loss. But as I found enough peace in myself, even amidst a pandemic and an ongoing hate and cruelty in the world, I've begun to learn to nurture and grow my capacity for love and bring it into my own teaching. And in doing that, I learned that in my teaching, I replicate the relationships I have with myself. When I loathed myself, internalizing the world's loathing of me, I projected loathing onto others. And when I learned to love myself, I began to love others for themselves. Your journey is going to be different. In fact, there are many kinds of whatever love you might give in computing education and many ways to become the person who might give it. Perhaps for you, it's therapy. Maybe it involves your faith. Perhaps it's just plain old reflection in action, as Donald Schoen would say. Or so rather than give advice and give you the questions, I'll give you the questions I asked myself to guide my own reflection. Who do you teach for? Who do you grade for? Who do you want your students to become, if anything? Who will you become as a teacher? What is your role of your emotions in your teaching? What is the role of your students' emotions? What is your relationship to yourself? How does that show up in your relationships with students? And for those of you who are researchers, I have for you bigger questions. When is computing amenable to whatever love? What parts aren't? Is being culturally responsive, relevant, and sustaining also being loving? Or are they different? Is centering generative AI in CS loving? In what contexts? Why? Can computing be a tool of whatever love? Is the impact of whatever love on CS? What is the impact of whatever love on CS learning? What is the impact of whatever love on our computational society more broadly? And what does doing research on whatever love in CS entail? I won't pretend that answering these questions and realizing a love in computing education is enough to part the dark clouds behind us. Far from it. Centering love, even just in computing education, may invite more hate. Love can be seen as a kind of weakness by the authoritarian politics of the moment. It can be seen as abandoning rigor and merit. It can be seen as an embrace of the feminine, which history shows as a path to disregard and dismissal. And it can be seen as a weakness to target for those who love power more than people. I do think, however, that love and the specific kind of whatever love in teaching and learning is a vision we can fight for. And a vision that, if we realize, is enough to transform our computational future and perhaps our political futures as well. And so whatever you are at this moment and wherever you will be this week and into the future, I can't wait to find out who you will become and how you will transform your teaching and scholarship. I look forward to rebuilding our institutions from this fascist rubble and to all the transformation it will enable. Thank you, and let's talk.